I see that the crowd is assembling, which is a wonderful thing. Please keep making your way in, find seats. There are a lot on the one side that are still open. Big crowd, Mike.
Yesterday, Finetti was a very popular guy.
Apparently so. I think that most of the crowd is kind of getting seated and getting ready. I would ask someone toward the back to swing the doors shut to kind of keep the noise from discussion down a little bit so everyone can hear the De Finetti lecture that's coming out. So whoever's last in, close those doors behind you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's an absolute delight to see so many friends all gathered together in one place and in person. And for those who've had the chance to hit lots of the great talks and things, wonderful to see the vibrancy and the life in the Bayes community that has survived the pandemic and that is going so well. Thanks to the organizers for putting together a tremendous program, including these wonderful invited sessions. 2016. ISBA started a tradition of having special named lectures. There's an old lecture and a young lecture. This one, I guess, would be the old lecture, named in honor of Bruno de Finetti and all of the incredible contributions that he made to Bayesian statistics, not only to statistics, but also to building the community of statisticians as well. And it's truly remarkable when you see the impact that people can have not only during their own lifetime, but that extend well beyond their lifetime. Today we're gathered to hear the De Finetti lecture. I'll introduce the speaker in just a moment. But you know, just a word or two about Bruno de Finetti's contributions. Regrettably, I never had a chance to meet him because I'm not quite so old as some others might be in the room. You know, his work, you know, in a sense, propelled Bayesian statistics forward, right? Three things that pop out to me and stand out to this very day. One is the focus on observables, really a focus on things you can observe, a focus on prediction and the impact that you can have if that's the central quantity of interest for statistics. Second, of course, is the famous theorem named in his honor. And we've seen that in several talks already. Stefan Lauritsen, of course, used it to connect Bayesian statistics to the traditions of classical statistics yesterday. We saw it in David Stevens' talk earlier today, the role of exchangeability and the importance when it comes to defining parameters and proceeding from there. And of course, his impact is not only in statistics, but there's a little thing called modern portfolio theory that led to a Nobel Prize. And I think that De Finetti created it in the 1930s, maybe. And then it kind of got forgotten for a few decades before it came back for a Nobel Prize. His contributions are just absolutely immense. And of course, we see it not only in the work, but also the Italian statistical community. And when I think about Italians who I think of as just superb statisticians, it's like Bayesian, 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 right? And many, of course, are here, which is a wonderful thing. The lecture is in his honor, and yet today I will have the privilege of introducing Mike West, who is a De Finetti lecturer for this year. You know, Mike, of course, truly is one of those figures who does not need any introduction, as the saying goes. Mike asked me to keep the introduction short so that he could spend more time in his talk, and that will be a wonderful for all of us. And yet there are a couple of words that I feel compelled to say about Mike. First, everybody knows him, right? And of course, people know Mike for many reasons. One is his role in building the community of statistics, a fundamental contributor and builder for ISBA, for the SPSS, Section on Bayesian Statistical Science, which is part of the American Statistical Association, big Bayesian organizations both. His role in building the group at Duke, which has contributed so much to the Bayes statistical community. All of these things are major contributions in and of themselves. But today we're not going to hear about his organizational abilities and what he can do to build the community. Instead, we're going to hear a little bit about his research. His research, if you look at his profile, is absolutely amazing. He's a fellow of this. Paper awards, one after another for the strong research that he's done. In fact, sort of dominated the Mitchell Prize, as many know. Themes that run throughout his work, quality applications, serious looks at novel problems, incredible creativity, and he's touched one field after another for parts of Bayesian statistics, really worked in the breadth of Bayesian statistics, which is quite remarkable. The great ones always have something very, very special about them. Mike has many of those special things about him. One is that he just knows what a good problem is. He has an intrinsic sense of the problem, not of today, but the problem that'll be big 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Today we're going to hear about some of that work, things that he's working on now, but in a sense very much the future of statistics, future of Bayesian statistics. Hard to separate those two, of course. Without further ado, I introduce Mike West, the Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of, oh my goodness, it's the old name, Statistics and Decision Sciences at Duke. Mike?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for to the program committee for the invitation to present the De Finetti Lecture at really what I regard as a breakout meeting for the society after we've been quarantined for 2.5 years from the social intercourse that this has been so important to our discipline. I was delighted and honored to receive the invitation, and it took me a microsecond to accept. So what I have today, given that I'm giving the old talk, is some new stuff. Of course, we all like to talk about what we're doing and have been doing recently, but it touches foundations, and I'm going to start by going back over the last few years to some older stuff that I know will be new to many of you. In the general area of dealing with multiple models and questions about how one utilizes Bayesian thinking, and I'll be specific about what I mean by Bayesian statistics in a moment, in the model uncertainty management enterprise generally. So do I need to stand here? I probably need to stand here. Sorry, I tend to jump and move around with talks. It's going to be an interesting hour. This is a sentence that I took from a paper, actually, if you want to read a bit more about De Finetti, written more recently, about 15 or 16 years ago, in Statistical Science. This quote is in there as well for a different reason. I like this quote. It's a De Finettian understatement. I like this quote because it really sort of hits on the theme today. Opinions are subjective views of reality, of the future, or the past. So today we're going to understand that as inferences and predictions from models. As Steve said, De Finetti was a predictivist, and in my professional life, I tend to live that dream too. So, although De Finetti was very involved in thinking about broader questions of decision analysis, most of his work and his impact on Bayesian thinking has been through modeling, inference, prediction. I call that belief analysis, and that's the phrase that I stole from Mike Goldstein, who used that term 30 years ago in a discussion of a paper by Dennis Lindley. That was one of the predecessor meetings to this, one of the Valencia meetings. But that's, to me, always been just half of Bayesian analysis. And the other side, the yin and the yang, are complete when it's married with decision analysis. And without one, the other is just incomplete. I think De Finetti had this view, although he focused mainly on applying the decision analysis rather than building foundational thinking and theory on that side of statistics. So we're going to look today at model uncertainty that now explicitly thinks about the goals that we define when we look at the use of models or sets of models. Before I jump into the sort of technical areas, I want to make connections, since this is the old guys talk. I want to make connections with two other fundamental subjectivists in most of their work, holistically Bayesian in the de Finetti tradition. I also never had the opportunity to meet de Finetti. I got close at a conference that we'll hear about later. But Jeff Harrison, to begin, always had decision analysis at the forefront of what he did. And he was a creative modeler, a creative belief analyst, a predictivist. But his work and his influence on my work was profoundly oriented around the use of models. And these are quotes from a paper that he published a number of years ago. Dennis Lindley, of course, wrote the book on decision analysis. And a simple quote from a later paper, the one I referenced earlier in terms of the terminology that Mike Goldstein gave belief analysis. Dennis, this is a wonderful paper. Politics aside, a main message in that paper 30 years ago was, hey, have we drifted away from foundations a little bit in not explicitly always recognizing decision goals along with the modeling questions? And I think these are important messages today in much more forceful ways, since much of the evolution of our discipline, of Bayesian statistics, is much more heavily focused on parameterizing models, thinking about parameters as the objects of inference. And this is very relevant to model uncertainty too. So today, our models are not interesting for those reasons. They're interesting because we have particular predictive goals and decision goals. So the theme of the talk, can I stand back? Am I still audible at the back if I, yep, I'm good here? Okay, thank you. The theme is Bayesian predictive synthesis, BPS. And I'm going to go back just a few years to the foundations of this line of research and then fast forward, connect it with various other themes, many of which are represented in talks and posters here this week, and then come to some more recent work, of course, that I find most interesting right now. We'll be talking about time series prediction and decisions in that context. And I'm going to be jumping between Ys, which are outcomes with a subscript t, explicitly in a time series context, but the general theoretical foundational questions will be presented free from that context, just for clarity. So Y is a vector, so we'll be thinking about a vector of macroeconomic indicators or a vector of stock prices or something of that nature. The model uncertainty predictive synthesis framework, let's have some notation. There won't be many equations, there'll be one important equation. And by the end of this hour, you will all have memorized that equation. Okay? I'll repeatedly display it just to make sure. So we're interested in predicting an outcome Y. We have some data. We have a predictive distribution, density P. And then there's a set of models. And I'm not going to tell you what they are or where they came from or whose models they are just yet. But there's a set of models. And each of those models could be used independently, individually, to predict Y. And so from a Bayesian point of view, from a purely holistic Bayesian point of view, that set of models provides information. And I'll use H, calligraphic H as information. And the foundational question that BPS revisited is the question of how to condition on H. So I have a prior, I get a posterior that integrates that information. Okay? And that's, for the next few minutes, the basis of just a couple of examples. I'm effectively going to work through 4 stages with 4 examples of Bayesian predictive synthesis as a framework, as a theoretically founded and a conceptually founded subjective Bayesian framework for doing that prior to posterior update. I'll link to some other literature. Again, it's the old guy's talk, so there'll be some older stuff referenced. I don't have a list of references. There's a paper I'll give you at the end. But I'll put some names on some of these slides because these have been important papers and important people in my thinking over the last number of years on this general topic. So pi here is just a symbol. It says, well, I want to predict y. I've got some past data d, and I've got this set of models that give me predictive distributions. What kind of function of all of these things makes sense to predict y? So pi is a combining rule. And of course, we're all sitting here at the ISBA conference. Well, you do Bayesian analysis, right? You just treat the models as uncertain, put prior probabilities on an update, right? Bayesian model averaging, as it became known in the 90s, and de Finetti and Harold Jeffreys were doing it in the 30s, right? Nothing wrong with that. That's one way you can do this analysis. Or you could just take an average that econometricians and the business community for many, many decades have been doing and calling them linear pools. More recently, machine learning related ideas and all kinds of things. Some of you will be familiar with stacking methods. Some of my inspiration and my interest in this area has come from, some of my stimulation intellectually has come from work that's grown over, 3-4 decades in macroeconomic forecasting, where these are front and central questions in policy decision making, in central banking systems. So there's some key people named down there, and some of them, at least one or two of them I know are at this conference. Some of the themes that this whole area involves then are in blue in this box. Okay? Individual models may suffer various biases, so you'd like a combination rule that sort of addresses that. Incomplete model set, what does that mean? Some in statistics would call it the M-open issue. All of the models may be completely hopeless and silly. What are you going to do when you combine them? We're forecasting macroeconomics. One model may be really good at forecasting inflation, but really bad at forecasting unemployment. And this other model is really good at forecasting unemployment. Okay? So what the names of the variables you're forecasting are matter. And then collinearities in a much more general sense. Models that all do the same thing, roughly indistinguishable. Or maybe there's one outlier and all of the rest are the same. So these are general themes in this whole area that we all have to address when we're faced with collections of models. But it's the red font that I'm going to hit on more today. Why are we doing it in the first place? What are the problems that we're addressing? What are the predictions and the decisions we want to feed into? And in that context, how do we behave coherently as Bayesians? So Bayesian predictive synthesis is an acronym, BPS, was attached several years ago to a way of doing this that is theoretically founded. It is fully Bayesian. And there are lots and lots of opportunities to exploit it in quite new ways. And it began by stepping back and saying, well, where do these models come from? Okay, where do these predictive distributions come from? And of course, as I've set things up, the predictive distributions come from a set of models. So I might be running 15 models separately and combining and comparing them, as many of us do all the time. The foundation of BPS takes a slightly different view. It links back to a very old literature going back to the 1960s of Bayesian expert or agent opinion analysis, where an individual Bayesian is receiving predictive distributions, subjective probabilities or model-based, from a set of individuals or agents or experts or models. And the little guy at the bottom could be your favorite deep learning algorithm. Okay? I have to put that in because I give talks to mixed audiences, and somebody will always, what about deep learning? Well, that's part of the story if you want it. So there's a venerable literature here going back, and Dennis Lindley was fundamental. And Dennis Lindley was a definition. He was a little bit younger than De Finetti. He learned a lot from De Finetti. My view, he also helped De Finetti think a lot about some of the things that they collectively were involved in developing in the 40s and 50s and into the 1960s. Okay, so, and Lindley also coined the phrase supra-Bayesian. So the photo there is an individual, a subjective Bayesian, who's looking at this problem and explicitly now views this information as data to condition on. And this is the formula, so look at it carefully and don't forget it, okay? This is arises from some theoretical work that Lindley was involved in, Christian Genet, who is around here somewhere, may not be at this meeting today, and Mark Shervish and others in the 80s. And what it says is there's a class of Bayesian models, there's a holistically Bayesian analysis that allows you to condition on this information, not directly by Bayes' theorem, but indirectly by marginalization over a latent factor space. So alpha here is a conditional PDF. It's what you would use to predict y if you knew this mysterious set of latent factors x. One for each of the models, each of them are the same dimension as y. And so one way to think about this, just to get the flavor of it, is to think about it as what some of our colleagues call a generative model. Nature generates a latent factor x1 from model 1, x2 from model 2, from the predictive distribution that those models supply. You, the Bayesian, then condition on those x's, and you build a supra-Bayesian model. Alpha is a conditional PDF for a future outcome given some predictors. Okay? Of course, now we step back. We don't know those predictors, so we have to average them out. Okay? So the rest of the talk is just a series of examples, some history without going into details on one example, and then 2 or 3 other examples of choices you could make for this alpha function. And I might slip into calling it the synthesis function, because that's what it's doing. It's synthesizing information coming from each of the models, or each of the Bayesians, or each of the robots, through a construct of each of those representing a latent factor, which is putatively related to y. Some of the history, some of the important work that we've published is with Ken McCallum and others, and I'll name them all later, which takes this into time series. So everything gets indexed by t, data revolves in time, and each time point one is receiving predictions from sets of models. Okay? And Kenichiro and other groups have been exploring and exploiting this in broader ranges of application in recent years, some represented at this conference. And each of these, most of these, are just different choices of the alpha function in the time series context. There's new work that's related to this, and I'll give some links at the end, that's expanding on the thinking and bringing in new ideas as well. So there it is again. Okay? I'm going to make it time dependent. And it's the same formula, it's just now we're explicitly standing here at the end of month t-1, forecasting the economic series into the next month and the following month and into the future. Okay? So this is looking one step ahead. The only difference is I've got a t on all of the symbols in the equation. And the examples that I referenced in macroeconomic and finance examples are very simple models. They take this alpha function and they build multivariate regression, linear regression, conditionally Gaussian, but with time-varying parameters. Okay? I'm a time-varying parameter type. Okay? These are linear regressions of y on the latent factors that are representing the information flowing from each of the models. Okay? With all of the uncertainty accounted for. And when you build a linear regression on a set of predictions, the regression coefficients, one of the things they do is correct for biases. A small regression coefficient says this predictor is hopeless, useless in the context of the others. So that model is downweighted. Regressions have intercepts and variances, conditional variances. In time series, we usually call them volatilities because they're often time varying. And these allow the view and embody the view that each of these models is sitting inside a supermodel. And they all may be hopeless. Okay? And the supermodel will then tend to try to account for that. The examples are fairly challenging in these papers. They're macroeconomics. Let me just cut to the example to give you a vignette here. I want, through this first example, to highlight this point. This is the point I've already mentioned several times. Why do we care? The central banks in the nations around the world, they don't care so much about forecasting next month's inflation. They care a lot about that. But they care about the path of inflation into the future because they're responsible for advising people who make decisions with a longer-term view to stabilizing economies. Okay? And this is a key point. When we synthesize predictions from models and we're interested in forecasting 24 months ahead, we synthesize forecasts for 20 months ahead. So the supermodel is built conditional on those goals. Now, of course, the downside is you have to build lots of different models for different goals. But it's fundamental if what you want to do is improve forecasting that advises decisions with respect to particular goals. You will not be able to see this, but and you're all familiar with different ways statistically of measuring, comparing performance. This simply, well, let me put them up. This simply comes from one of these papers, which shows that Bayesian predictive synthesis with very standard time series models, dynamic latent factor models, purely wholly subjective Bayesian analysis to integrate information from different models can beat, in terms of traditional statistical metrics, and in these examples dominates effectively uniformly in sequential prediction over the period of time we took. BMA, of course, and other methods of pooling are all in there, but BMA is an average of what you've seen in those models. It has no way of dealing with model set incompleteness. In addition, it has other features that most of you are familiar with. It does not address specific goals. So if you're forecasting 2 years ahead on a monthly basis, BMA is going to be fine in the short term, but it's not going to be competitive long term. So most of what I want to address today, because it's related to the newer stuff, is more traditional in thinking about how you pull together information from models. And this is the second example. One particular choice of the alpha function, the synthesis function, leads to a linear pool. You've got a set of probabilities pi that you assign to each of these models. That's a theorem. That's an example of BPS. It's fully justifiable in a Bayesian framework. I'll call these weights initial weights. BPS, the theory doesn't tell you how to choose them. It doesn't tell you where they come from. It leaves you free to do whatever you think is relevant. Okay? And many people, the literature down there, again, it's largely econometrics, Bayesian econometricians, have been in the business for many years of using linear combinations of predictive densities and choosing the weights just by dreaming up some numbers or optimizing them with respect to particular goals. And of course, doing Bayesian model averaging. Okay? Different ways in which one can utilize this particular special case. And part of my inspiration in this area has also come from that literature, because some of the work I've seen there, I've always understood what's being done and regarded it as really good empirical work, but always fought shy a little bit of embracing it in my own thinking because I couldn't understand where it came from. Foundationally, I now understand that. And I'll point out here, again on this model set incompleteness theme, that some of you that are not too far at the back of the room will see that the summation over j here has a j equals 0. So pi 1 to pi 15, whatever capital J is, may be tiny. And the index J is something else that we call the baseline model, which is a safe haven when all of the models that you're looking at are, well, not so good. So let me give you some insights into this through a little example. And I'm bringing in something else here that's going to be very important later on. So this is moving into the time series context. It's moving into an example, a very interesting example with specific goals. This example comes from a paper published recently. And this example, we can, the time series extension is almost immaterial for the basic ideas, but very important in terms of driving the initiation of those ideas to begin. We call this AVS. It's just another acronym. I've been too prolific in recent years in generating acronyms, I know, but this one works. I want to make a big connection here. This is a really important connection. I made connections with macroeconomic thinking and all kinds of innovations there. At this conference, there are several talks on very related themes. The term generalized Bayesian updating, Steve Walker, Chris Holmes, and their groups, and several other groups, have been developing foundationally relevant thinking and methodology on that in recent years that intersects very much with BPS. In terms of AVS specifically, the specific question of goal-oriented model weighting, specifically on the predictive side rather than the decision side, I'm mentioning a paper there by the New Zealand group. They've used the term focus prediction, and the construction, the specific methodological construction that AVS uses is very similar. They're doing effectively the same thinking, but details may differ. So the AVS example, I'll just convey the idea for example and give you actually this is the second formula, but it's just an example of the alpha function. It's a model uncertainty where the models, we've got several macroeconomic time series, and it's a time-varying vector order regressive model, so each of those time series is predicted by any number of variables in the past on any of the other series, it's monthly data, and by any of the variables, the other variables in the same month. So it's a simultaneous dynamic model. So we've got lots of models. It's a model. I don't like the term model selection because I rarely select models. There are lots of models, all possible subset regressions with many potential predictors in 7 dimensions. And the models, of course, are time varying, so there's a T on the calligraphic M as well as an index for the model, but that's not really, that's just a detail here. So I'm using the time series specific version of this particular example of the BPS formula. We're doing linear pooling, but we want the weights to change in time. And the particular form of the weight function that we use here in AVS updates these weights sequentially, kind of like BMA, but it's a generalization. It's a choice. So STJ in month T for model J is some metric. I use the term score since that has become the term that we've been using. It's a utility metric. It's a measure that we want to be high. And tau is some positive number. Okay? So if you are interested in 24-month ahead forecasting, choose a score based on how well model J forecast the current month 24 months ago. Okay, so again, it's a goal-oriented version of Bayesian updating if you do BMA. The generalization is you have multiple utilities. One of the themes in where I'm going here today is multidimensional decision analysis, when you may have competing utilities. So my score vector now, you'll have noticed, I didn't say, I apologize, that bold-faced font is vector or matrix. I don't think I have any matrices. So I might be interested simultaneously in forecasting 12 months ahead and 24 months ahead. and I want to score models based on how well they do on an annual forecasting basis. Or, and this is really where the macroeconomic policy interests come, what about the next 24 months collectively, the path of the economy into the future? That's really what matters in the decision problems, right? It's okay if we get inflation around about 2% over the next 2 years, but we don't want to go up to 25% before we get down to 2%. We'd like a smooth path down from wherever we are now, 10%. So this is, I'm sorry, that's exactly what I said. I was running ahead of my slides. Okay, so again, as with the first example, this is goal-oriented model weighting. I'm not interested in the models. I'm interested in prediction. But just to hit on some differences with respect to what I know we're all very familiar with, let me pull out a couple of pictures from this paper. Steve, I forgot to put my timer on, so I'll rely on the chair instead. So this is a heat map. Let me go through it fairly carefully. The horizontal axis is time. This is monthly data over a period of years. The two vertical black lines represent late start of the Great Recession and the end of the Great Recession. I believe the Great Recession started about 13 months earlier than is typically the popular timing, and there's reasons for that, of course. The vertical axis, you can't read the names. These are potential predictors. Okay? This is from the analysis pulled out just to look at predicting inflation 24 months ahead. Okay? So the model was run, the analysis was run over the period of time, and various metrics can be computed. And what this is showing through time, red means low, and blue means high. This is just taking a look in the inflation line of the model at the weights, the AVS updated weights, as they change through time, on each of the possible predictors that give you all of the rows. And the rows at the bottom of the vertical axis are the short-term predicted, last month's inflation, last month's unemployment. The ones at the top are 12 months ago. And these probabilities were just thresholded to give a nice picture. So what we see is BMA has some very short-term. The horizontal blue line at the bottom is the intercept. The next horizontal blue line is last month's inflation. That's an important predictor of this month's inflation. But then as you go up, you see things are sparser, and you see fewer longer-term lags selected by BMA. The AVS analysis is scored on 24-month forecasting. And what we see there, we see some similar patterns, but we see in particular, we see blue at the top. And we see a lot of blue on 12-month inflation and a couple of other variables. So the scoring of models based on specific predictive goals influences the way in which different models are weighted, and influences within that the way in which different predictive variables appear to be important. And this time variation, because it's dynamic, and you'll see in the recessionary period, the AVS analysis jumped around a bit more because relationships broke down and were changing. And you'll see some scatter up and down the rows that is largely due to dependencies across models and the collinearity questions. So if you care about this kind of introspection into what matters and how and when and how it changes, you can dig that out as if you're using BMA. But it's really the predictive value that drives the interest in this scoring of models based on how well they predict particular goals. Statistically, this is a log scoring metric that should be high for a good analysis. BMA is much more susceptible to very short-term volatility in the data, so it bombs in the recession. And somehow or other AVS smooths that out and does generally better. This is probably the most important picture with respect to the conversation about BMA and goal-oriented forecasting. Let's take one of those. Let's take the top left, inflation, for those of you on my left. So the red line is AVS and the blue line is BMA. The x-axis here is the number of months ahead you are forecasting from 1 to 24, And the vertical axis is just root mean squared error point forecasts. And so you see that and there's nothing wrong with BMA if you want to forecast in the very short term. And it's uniform across these 7 selected macroeconomic series that for a couple of months, a few months, it's perfectly fine, or at least not disadvantaged relative to a model that is scored on forecasting 24 months ahead, okay? Which is very disadvantaged in forecasting 1 or 2 months ahead. But then, you know, there's a switchover and the long-term forecasting ability of the model that's focused on forecasting long-term is very clear. Okay, you got it now? There'll be a quiz after the talk. Example 3. So here we are. This is my posterior distribution based on my prior data D, and based on the information I've received from this set of models or individuals or robots in terms of the densities Hj. All I have to do is choose alpha and run home. Okay? So here's another choice you could make. And we call this outcome-dependent model weighting. And you'll see it's basically the same as the example I've just been describing. There is a set of initial probabilities, and there's a j equals 0. But there's something else, and slight abuse of notation. There are some positive or generally non-negative functions of the outcome, alpha j of y, that are in that sum too. Okay? So each model has its predictive density weighted by pi j, but also modified by some function alpha j. This wasn't my idea. Okay? I don't know who practiced it first, but the first reference at the bottom, Kapitanios, Mitchell, Price, and Fawcett, an earlier Bank of England report, I think 2013, introduced me to this notion. It's kind of weird, you know? If you want to weight models differently, you have to know the outcome that each of them is predicting before you can weight them. Can't be done, right? Can be done. All you have to do, because we now understand it's Bayesian, is make sure that the choices of the alpha function lead to the left-hand side being a density. Why is it interesting? Well, let's use our running example. Model 1 may be really good at forecasting changes in national consumption when national consumption is raging, when it's really high. Model 2 may be much better at forecasting consumption when consumption is very poor, is very low, and inflation and unemployment. Model 1 may be really brilliant at dealing with inflation and forecasting inflation if inflation and unemployment are in this regime, you know, a good economic growth regime. But Model 2 may be much better if we're moving into a recession. So where you are in Y space can and should influence your thinking about how models are going to play out in predicting how that economy is evolving. So this paper, the Bank of England paper, was inspired. And they built some model of these alpha j's and fit them to data and did some things. And that got me really interested. It was actually largely responsible for BPS. It's wholly Bayesian. And you have many, many choices you can make for these alpha functions. You can use them to modify the predictive distributions from the models to deal with various aspects of miscalibration and bias, and learn those things in a time series context based on historical data. You can use them to deal with model dependencies. And how you do it, how you construct them, how you choose them and estimate them on data, that's your choice. You are now the super Bayesian, this is your choice. BPS provides the foundation for this, but it's just one example. Okay? So I'm going to continue this example, but I want to introduce decisions before I do this. So I'll come back to this particular special case of BPS in a minute. I want to go back to Professor de Finetti, and I think he would have liked this. you know. We call it predictive synthesis. It's predictive opinion synthesis. It's founded in subjective Bayesian combination of opinions of individuals, going back to the opinion analysis literature. People used to call it the expert opinion analysis literature, but we know how much the adjective is lived up to. But it's incomplete because it doesn't involve the decision aspects that drive the interest in utilizing these models in the first place. It does in part if the decision is explicitly, let's forecast the path of the economy over the next 24 months, then AVS is doing that. But there are other kinds of decisions. So, as the old guy speaker today, let me introduce another Bayesian. And, you know, some regard George and most of his work as objective Bayesian, and a lot of it was, and he struggled to make it objective, of course. But I did have the good fortune to meet and spend time on many occasions with George. And he was fundamentally a subjective Bayesian. I don't think he ever really got into the de Finettian way of thinking because he was working in industry most of his career and before he moved to University of Wisconsin. There's a theme here. Jeff Harrison took over George's position when George left the UK for the University of Wisconsin. And Jeff Harrison, of course, was a diehard subjectivist who then went on to found the University of Warwick Statistics Department, which since then, although it grew slowly, you know, has been for many years, decades now, the dominant statistics department. I would say in Europe, but let's just say in the UK. So George was interested in decision problems that are no less important and much more important today than they were when he was doing it. Okay, reinforcement learning. My running example: policy decisions in macroeconomic monetary policy arenas. Banks feed information, models feed information to policymakers who then have to make adjustments to economic policy that then influence the economy and then become outcomes of that intervention as well. So here D is a design variable, a vector of things that are to be chosen, and this picture is just, you know, Y depends on D, and maybe you want to maximize Y, but you've got some constraints. You might want to think about a target range for inflation and unemployment as Y, 1 to 3% for inflation and 3 to 5% for unemployment. We'd like unemployment in each of the next several months to be moving towards that range. How do we tinker with central bank interest rates, the costs to commercial and private banks for borrowing and lending money, and other controls. Let's sell all the bonds. Good grief, it's time. So, in the context of the sort of theoretical structure today, the predictive distributions depend on the decision. Because if I'm predicting the economy over the next 12 months, I want to know what the central bank at the end of this month is going to do in terms of its decisions on interest rates and other things. So the decision is critically important part of the predictive distribution. Most people don't work in that way of thinking, and it's a very, very important point to make. Well, if I apply Model J, to do decision analysis, to choose D, I'm a Bayesian. If I was just using Model J, I need a utility function. And boy, in most cases, that will depend on the model. Okay? Your utility functions will very often depend on the model. So if I do Bayesian analysis within Model J, I get an optimal decision dj. And wouldn't I want then to back up and say, well, look, I want to weight models that make good decisions more highly. So the focus of the model uncertainty question is now broadened to encompass the yang as well as the yin. Okay? Very important area. I mean, some of you work in reinforcement learning, which in my opinion is a nice outgrowth of basic foundational Bayesian decision analysis when it works well. But there are lots of things there that I don't understand yet. And as an area for foundational Bayesian thinking, I think it's a very nice one. Let me introduce yet another subjective Bayesian. I don't think Harry, I know Harry, I used to work with him. I don't know that he ever read anything that De Finetti wrote. Now, those of you that do, you know De Finetti is hard to read. I know from my Italian friends it's as hard to read in Italian as in the English translations, okay? But, and some of it, I don't know, but some of it is worth reading and rereading. So yes, De Finetti, I was going to mention this, Steve stole my thunder here. De Finetti was a foundational thinker in various areas, including in finance and portfolio analysis. And Harry is generally regarded, because he got the prize, the Nobel Prize, as the founder of modern portfolio theory. And you know, he didn't know De Finetti. Whether he read De Finetti's work, I don't know. I kind of doubt it, because he was coming from a very different world. But you know, as one of the players, I mean, he's holistically subjective Bayesian, really. So here we're interested in forecasting financial time series with respect to very specific decisions. We want to make money, but we want to condition those decisions so that we don't open ourselves up to losing a lot of money. And there's lots of other dimensions and how you present your strategy to your clients in your investment company. So here, the predictive distributions don't depend on the decision. We've got a set of different models, and they may all give very similar predictions, but the ways they characterize uncertainty will differ subtly, and that can be very important for portfolios. The weights of the tails, the small changes in interdependencies predicted from models can massively influence portfolios. So here the distributions don't depend on the decision. The decision is a vector of portfolio weights, such that the linear combination of the returns from the financial indices with respect to those weights is what you win or lose. And the utility function in this area will be very, very dependent on the models typically. Okay? And we can talk about why in details if you don't already know that. So if I choose model J and run with it over a period of time here, I'm in a time series setting, and do optimal portfolio analysis with a particular class of utility functions, utility for money, whatever they are, Markowitz-style utility functions and generalizations of them, very standard Bayesian decision analysis. Then I will get, and again it's indexed by t because it's sequentially in time, an outcome from that model utility combination. And the outcome I use R for the return on the portfolio. That is the realization of both the outcome in terms of nature generated the Ys and your decision a day ago or a week ago or a month ago targeting a particular utility function. So George has a distribution that depends on the decision in each model. Harry has a distribution that depends on the model but not the decision. So two very different frameworks, but both explicitly saying, oh, if the decision is your goal, then integrate it into your thinking about, you know, balancing different models against each other. Okay? I like to use the term betting when we work on fundamental research in statistics that's applied to finance and this general area. And again, that's a real deep De Finetti heritage point, that he was very, very involved in thinking about subjective probability through individual propensities to gamble, not quite in the same way as Savage and others later on, but it's all related to this view. So as with George, wouldn't Harry want to say, well, look, I want models that, yeah, I care about predicting the stock indices over the next 3 or 4 days, but I also care about how these individual models would advise me to make decisions on my portfolio day by day. Okay, same equation, the outcome-dependent example. I'm now going to give you a picture from an example in time series. So everything gets a T on it. Here I am on day t with information dt minus 1. I'm forecasting the vector of financial indices tomorrow, time t. I'm receiving from each of these models predictive distributions, ht. And this is the portfolio context, so that they don't depend on the decisions within the models. And I'm going to look at just an example where I'll flip backwards and forwards here so you see the change, where the alpha function now is used. Because I can choose it to be whatever I like, I'm the super Bayesian, it can depend on anything I want it to depend on. So I'm now explicitly modifying that outcome-dependent weight function to integrate the decision that comes from each of the models. And I'll use the AVS style weighting, which is with no loss of generality. Absolutely no loss of generality. I think it's important to say that. And this is from an example. I'll give you a picture in a minute. So it's like AVS. I've got a score function, which is a vector of utilities. In the time series analysis, it's done day by day, so there's a suffix t. I could change it every day. There's a suffix j to index the model. The realized utility will depend on what the stock prices are tomorrow when I see them, yt. Okay? And I'm using model j, which is forecasting yt. And model j, within model j, the optimal decision vector is d with a t and a j on it. Okay? And then tor is some vector of weights. Okay? And the linear combination it implies of the utilities in the S vector is a way of dealing with multiple utilities that may be concordant or may be conflicting. And different values within the tor vector will weight different dimensions of utility differently. Okay? And so the critical point here is this is extending out I said it's a bit mysterious, this outcome-dependent way of thinking, because you're weighting models based on something, the outcome y you don't know yet. Okay? But you can do it as long as the left-hand side is a density. Okay? We're now putting the decisions within each model into that weighting. Okay? So we like models that we expect to do a good prediction, will give a high weight, but we also like models that give a decision that leads to a good outcome in the particular decision problem that we're addressing. So this is an extension, it's an example of BPS, and it's an extension of the AVS style, the focused prediction style, of weighting historical models based on historical data. And you can see the concordance. Okay, so I have 5 minutes. I'll put my timer on. So there's the formula in this particular example. Okay, I've just replaced alpha with its form. And I want to make the point that if you think about what that's saying, that's distribution of y, it's averaging over models. So let's back up, that's a marginal distribution. In the joint distribution for the outcome y and the model jointly. Okay? So this is the joint distribution over the outcome y and the models jointly. And I know some of you are sitting here thinking, where the heck does tor come from? I'm going to be brief here. I will skip the next slide since I'm running out of time. Again, this relates to the literature, the AVS literature, which relates to generalized Bayesian updating, where variants of this kind of idea have evolved, usually with a one-dimensional score. BMA is a special case, of course. And it's been a bit mysterious as to where this parameter comes from. I won't do justice to it today, but I'll mention, and I'll skip the next slide, that the way we do this is to use an extension of what is called entropic tilting. Again, this has come primarily from the Bayesian econometrics literature. Okay? And you can see in the formula there, I prefer to call it exponential tilting, and that connects with other areas of statistics. But it's called entropic tilting because it involves Kullback-Leibler kinds of constructions. There's a lot more there that I regard as pure Bayesian decision analysis. that allows you to operationalize this particular example. TOR is a vector of things that you need, but it's not a parameter that you learn from data. It's a choice you make. Okay? Let me skip the next slide, which is a pretty slide, but nevertheless, and come back to Harry. So this is just a vignette from an example with financial data, just to fix the idea for the audience today. So this score vector is a vector of utilities. And in Model J, RTJ is tomorrow's return. We don't know it. It's a linear combination of the stock indices, or the FX, or whatever they are, based on the optimal decision implied by that model. Okay? So the models may give very similar predictive distributions, but they may give quite different results in terms of the implied predictive distribution of the return of an optimized portfolio within that model. So you want a return high, so M here is a target. Okay, 25% on an annual basis. Make that a daily return. But you don't want a risky decision. You don't want a risky bet. So you might want a component like the second component in that vector, okay, that you want to be high. Okay? You don't want a large deviation from that return because then you're dealing with potential for very, very large losses. And this is just Markowitz. This is just, this is just Markowitz mean variance optimization. But it's much more general than that because this particular choice arises with more relevant practical bounded utility functions as well. And it can work. And this is a picture from the paper here. Let's focus on the upper frame. So this is running through time. It's from 2009 to March or April 2010. I'm sorry, 2014. And so you'll see some variation over time. The upper graph is the evolution of cumulative returns, empirically realized cumulative returns. And the two blue and green lines are AVS and BMA. And the red line, of course, is what we will now call BPDS, for Bayesian Predictive Decision Synthesis, which is integrating the ability of each of the models to advise through the optimal Bayesian decision analysis within the model, the decision that is faced. Okay? So it's explicitly now weighting predictive accuracy of each model and expected predictive accuracy with historical performance in the implied optimal decision of each model with the expected outcome of the optimal decision within that model. And, in the end of the recession there, everything was going bad, so the returns went down. But then as we move through time, now and again, you'll see the red line beating the other two. But then when we get to the sovereign debt crisis, the EU sovereign debt crisis in late 2009, 2010, there are more major gains based on primarily on the decisions implied by the models in rebalancing their portfolios. This is FX and the euro and the Japanese yen and the Swiss franc and things like that are in there. So the particular decision outcome here, in terms of really the first element of the vector, was generally improving and then more substantially improved. The lower frame is a risk-adjusted version of this, the Sharpe ratio, for those of you that know and may care. And the differences aren't so great, but later on through the debt crisis, there is some improvement there. But the important point is that the risk profile did not suffer while the returns improved over the long haul. Final point, the super Bayesian framework that Dennis Linley really conceived, actually in the 70s, not just the 80s, a way of thinking about models providing information that you can condition on in now a variety of ways. Through integrating the decision explicitly here, we've been led to a broadening of that understanding of what a super Bayesian has available. And the analysis that underlies this picks up on the Yang side of the Bayesian predictive synthesis and now explicitly begins to ask the super Bayesian decision maker to represent utilities that depend on models as well as on outcomes. So back to Professor De Finetti. I don't think any of us would disagree with his statement. I interpret opinions as predictions, inferences, what you get from a model that predicts a Y. And I hope that I've given you some thoughts about the broader perspective, and I hope you'll agree with me, and I think some of you may want to disagree, but we'll see that problems depending on multiple models, inferences they make, and the decisions that they would imply if you adopt them are at least as interesting. And I was inspired by several people I've mentioned today and several I haven't. So with that, I will thank you for your attention and thank some of the students who've thankfully decided to work with me over the years and non-student collaborators. At the bottom, I'm referencing a paper that's recently been put on archive with Emily Talman. That the talk isn't wholly that paper. There's a lot more in that paper than we have here today. But that's the general reference that anybody who's interested in picking up any of the themes may find interesting. With that, I do have a bit of PR in case anybody wants to short-circuit the business of going to Hoover. There are several posters and several talks at this meeting, some very explicitly in this general area of thinking a little bit more broadly, as Dennis encouraged us to 30 years ago, about Bayesian analysis in the model uncertainty context, and some other themes that are woven in there. I'll point in particular to, well, some of you were at Herman van Dijk's talk yesterday. We'll hear more from Professor van Dijk in a moment. There's a Wednesday afternoon talk that's on the generalized Bayes updating theme that I will attend. And then on Friday, the box talk at the bottom is more explicitly focused on some of the themes that we've talked about today with various applied motivations and various theoretical connections. So thank you for your time, and it's time for me to step back and as the old speaker in the crowd today, thank the program committee for the opportunity to speak today in this lovely environment with this most of our community represented in different ways, and thank you for your attention.
We have two wonderful discussants lined up for the talk. The first, in my American pronunciation, is Sylvia Fruwer-Schnatter, and we will get that up and running very soon. Sylvia.
To open the slides. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's just wonderful to be standing here. And I would like to start by thanking Alex and her amazing local organizing committee for what they have achieved in organizing this conference. So when I signed the contract with Hotel Bonaventure as ISBA President 2020 in July, this was a few months into the pandemic, and the whole uncertainty and anxiety was amazing. There was a lot of uncertainty and anxiety whether we're actually going to be here. And I'm so delighted and so happy that it turned out. And Alex and her team has been doing an amazing job because she renegotiated the contract with Hotel Bonaventure many times. So many thanks, Alex, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. And then I would like to thank the program chair and the scientific committee for this amazing program and for inviting Mike to deliver the De Finetti Lecture. Many thanks to Mike for a very inspiring talk. And for me personally, this is kind of amazing because it kind of brings me back in this closing a cycle that started actually in 1982 when I started my scientific career. And my very first Bayesian conference I was attending was a workshop in memory of Bruno de Finetti, which was organized in Innsbruck in September 1986. So some of you might not know a biographical detail of de Finetti. He was actually born in Austria, in Innsbruck. His father was an engineer who was very much involved in the enterprise of building the rail track over the Adelberg, which separates Austria then from Switzerland. And Reinhold Viertel, who was the first Austrian Bayesian, but then decided to move into a different area, was organizing this workshop to celebrate the 80th birthday of Bruno de Finetti, and regrettably, de Finetti passed away before the workshop, and it was a workshop in memory of Bruno de Finetti. So Mike and me, we came kind of close to meet de Finetti on this occasion. And as you can see, I found it interesting to go back to the proceedings from that workshop. And we were already there, the three older guys and girls, because in the proceedings you will find a paper by Mike about binary time series, a paper by Hermann about simultaneous equation models, and my very first paper on doing hydrological forecasting using a Bayesian approach. And I will come back to that paper a bit later. So Mike has been explaining the whole BPDS approach very, very clearly, so I don't think I have to recap it in much details. So the idea is we have this set of models, we have a baseline model, and then we are trying to work out what the predictive density here is. Predictive density from the individual models is then combined with these weights, and in BMA, these weights would just be the posterior probability of the models based on the marginal likelihood. And in this BPDS approach, you have a combination of, is not really a probability of a model, but a measure how well a model is performing. And this is kind of tilted with this function here that takes into consideration how the forecast actually is related to the decision that you're making here. So this is a multi-criteria score function. So this paper was really taking me back down the memory lane and rethinking a lot of things I've been doing in this 40 years, and I've got only like 8 minutes left. So I will focus on, well, I will make basically five remarks on that paper. So Mike has been concentrating on applications of this whole approach in macroeconomics and in finance and in decision design. But I think it's a very pioneering work, and there is a lot of applications outside of this area coming from. And let me briefly go back to my PhD thesis, which was on forecasting flood events, hydrological forecasting. And in the thesis, I was using a dynamic Bayesian model to do that. So this whole model was operating in real time. And what you can see here, I don't know how clear you can see this because it's just a screenshot from the thesis here, is that we have rainfall stations and then stations where the runoff is measured. And as you go down the river, so this is in Carinthia, the river is the Drau or Drava, as it's called in Slovenian. We are doing the forecasting of the runoff in each of these stations, and you can see, like when you go down the river, as this runoff is accumulating, and we were trying to forecast in all these stations, and these forecasts were then the foundation for the local authorities to make decisions whether to clear an area, whether to build up flood warnings. But I would have loved to have this Bayesian predictive decision synthesis back then, because we always got this feedback like the whole system is no longer running well, and it would have been lovely to include this information already back then. And so I see a lot of potential of this approach also in areas like environmental sciences, where scientists and statisticians make forecasts, and to integrate this with the goal that decision makers are pursuing here. Now, my second comment, and I think this is where this approach is going to shine in the future, is multi-step forecasting. Like many people teaching econometric methods to students, it's always kind of frustrating. You do a short-time forecast, this is working well, and when you go longer ahead in the future, these models are simply not working. So in preparing this discussion, I've been thinking a lot what is actually the problem when you use marginal likelihoods to pick a model, and then you look at multi-step forecasting here. And I think there's a kind of a quite simple answer to that, because marginal likelihoods in BMA, they are kind of optimized for one-step ahead forecast. So what you see here is a representation of the marginal likelihood as the product of one-step ahead densities. We very often use this to compute the marginal likelihood. And now when you think of multi-step ahead forecasting, it's not the one-step ahead density, but more periods ahead. And I've been making this little sketch here down on the left-hand side, where you see the goal in multi-step ahead forecasting is like this red predictive density that we're seeing here. And there are many, many paths that lead to these predictive densities. Like people said in the ancient Rome, all roads lead to Rome. And marginal likelihood kind of would try to find out the most likely path given the data, whereas here what is of interest is like where they end up in the long run. So I thought this really interesting, and I think it's really something that people are going to use a lot when they want to do more than one step ahead forecast. Now, my remaining 3 remarks are more questions than remarks. What I didn't understand from both the presentation and reading the paper is actually what the role of the baseline distribution is. It seems to be the baseline model, it seems to be there to address model set incompleteness. And then, we all know this famous quote by George Boxall's model are wrong, but some of them are useful. And my kind of impression here is that this baseline model is there to deal with, I would call a toxic model pool. So all models are wrong, and none of the models is useful there. And I've been thinking a lot, even as a PhD student, about this discrepancy. So when you have such a toxic model pool, I just made up the name for the presentation here, you compute the marginal likelihood, and one of these models will have a very large likelihood, marginal likelihood, but it's not going to be a useful model. And the reason is that these model probabilities in BMA are only relative measures, so one model compared to the other model, a bit like BSA. And I just would like to point out that there are also absolute measures to evaluate models. And this goes back to a paper by Rosenblatt, the Rosenblatt transform, where you plug in the observed observations into the one-step ahead predictive density. So what we have here is the CDF, the one-step ahead CDF, not the PDF. And then you plug in the observed YT. And if the model is correct, then this sequence of residuals should be uniform. And I always found this idea very fascinating and was kind of part of my PhD thesis. So I wrote a paper about that and submitted this. So I was doing like kind of transformations of these residuals and doing some significance tests, whether they are independent, whether they are correlated. And it was very hard to publish the paper. The non-Bayesians didn't like it because it was Bayesian in the first place, and the Bayesians didn't like it because I did significance tests. But later on, there is now a huge literature working with these recursive residuals, and Adrian contributed a lot, and other people in this room. So I think this is an important way to look at the absolute measure here. And I was kind of wondering if some statistics based on these recursive residuals, because they are an absolute measure of model performance, could be added or should be added to the set of score functions in Bayesian predictive density synthesis. No, it's not density, PPDS. I should have practiced this. Because I think what the ultimate goal here is to have informed decisions based on useful models. Okay, so I'm kind of running out of time. I've like 10 seconds left, or so let me then briefly skip. Let me get to the whole slide here. Let me skip these 2 slides here, and let me finish with my last questions. So what I'm kind of have been asking myself, how could we thrive for uncertainty quantification in this Bayesian predictive decision synthesis? Because when we do model selection in a traditional framework, then we can learn how sure or how uncertain the decision is. And my question is, in this Bayesian predictive density synthesis, can we quantify whether the decision was chosen with high confidence or whether it was a risky business? So in concluding, congratulations to Mike for a really inspiring and thought-provoking paper, and many thanks for our friendship. Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion, Sylvia. Mike will hold time for questions until after Herman has had his discussion. Next up is Herman Van Dyke, again, American pronunciation of his name. And he will stay strictly to his 10 minutes, and then Mike will respond.
Okay, so thanks for being here. Okay, so since I'm partially employed by Norcus Bank nowadays, the usual disclaimer applies. And anyway, I have 4 comments. One is had to connect the subjective statistical philosophy from de Finetti and the advances in scientific modeling in recent decades in the non-experimental sciences. So my second comment is to give a very simple, basic interpretation of BPS, and this is not to downgrade it. I find it very fascinating, but to make it transparent, to show you that for very simple cases, everyone truly can understand it. Then my third comment is that I will show some figures about the excellent possibilities for BPS extension in different fields of science, like medicine, bioinformatics, etc. However, there is usually a however with scientists. The technical computational challenge is there. Find a connection between model complexity and Monte Carlo simulation, and the fundamental model information challenge, which is also an issue. And I will give suggested a research path for tackling, which basically Mike has indicated already. Okay, so my first comment, and so I am, I guess here the only one, probably, who met de Finetti, and also Dennis Lindley. In 1976, I presented my PhD paper on importance sampling at a conference in Fontainebleau. And clearly what happened, Dave Finetti gave a talk, and he wrote on the green board with chalk, not this way, probabilities do not exist, period. I add here like physical quantities, but of course we know it, they're a state of the mind. But to tell you what was kind of very interesting, he talked about it for 5 minutes, and then he switched to Italian. And at the front row were Arnold Zollner, Dennis Lindley, Bruce Hill, Jacques Drez, in the second row, Adrian Smith as a student, Jose Bernardo, and several others. No one dared to say anything. After 10 minutes, it was Dennis Lindley who said, "Professor De Finetti, you talk Italian." Oh, he said. He switched to English, but after 5 minutes again, he switched to Italian. I never understood it, but that one sentence, probability do not exist like physical quantities. It's a wonderful memory. Anyway, Dennis Lindley was there also. It's a kind of comment on the technical part, which is, since I think it's one of the first presentations of so-called the Monte Carlo simulation, where Markov chain Monte Carlo, and I've been known to do some sequential importance sampling. But he commented, Dennis Lindley, so I was this very nervous PhD student, and he said, Monte Carlo simulation idea is very interesting, but it's frequentist reasoning about the convergent properties. I wrote down on the green board, my Monte Carlo estimator is asymptotically unbiased and consistent. Then I said, wipe out that asymptotically unbiased. So he always said a Bayesian version of MC is necessary. So far about memories. Okay, but my focus is on non-experimental sciences using time series, and the examples in economics, medicine. I work a bit on DNA data, also some psychiatric data. I love, as a hobby, astronomy, the archaeology of the universe. But okay, so my comment on the subjective philosophy of scientific modeling. So the advancement of science in the 20th century occurred in many fields using scientific modeling. So the key point here is data are given. Usually, diagnostic step in pattern recognition. This implies, I'm sorry for some of you to say, all priors in my field are more or less data dependent. And key point 2 is that scientists usually focus on the information, the likelihood. The prior is a bit about sensitivity analysis, and the scientific purpose, Mike did that very brilliantly, given the data, make conditional probabilities about uncertain events, and we all know that. And the key point 3 to learn is MC, Monte Carlo, is experiments with many pseudo-random numbers. So the data information, the number of generated draws, will usually dominate any prior. So the MC continues using frequentist logic about convergence of any MC method. That's okay, a basic structure of the BPS model. And so Mike had the mixture idea. I'll do it a bit more simple. So we have the forecast values from n models. We have some random variables to combine these. Everyone knows that, and it's a bit a simplified version. The decomposition of the joint density of yt, vt, y tilde t is that conditional density vt given yt given vt at vt. And what is crucial about a simple version of BPS, if all this is continuous random variables, then the combination density, it's similar to what Mike said, the alpha, is a multivariate normal combination density. The VTs are latent random walks. And so what is so very interesting, that the corresponding equation system, an econometric interpretation or statistical interpretation of Bayesian predictive synthesis, is that it's just a multivariate regression model. Mike mentioned that, with generated regressors and draws from the given as draws of the forecast and these continuous time-varying parameters. And time-varying parameters are random walks. And then you do a very clever, that's Prado West, very clever tuning of parameters. And this makes, for this simple case, it very transparent, applicable to many cases, and how to generalize that I can. So the algorithm also, I skipped that in because of time, so you do forecast, etc. Okay, the fundamental points I want to make here is that Monte Carlo opened up Bayesian approach to non-standard distributions that occur in many fields of science, and the dynamic methods, which were very important, the normal Kalman filters, opened up much more flexible modeling. Mike West and also Sylvia's work were pioneers in that. Okay, so what I think, my third comment was the excellent possibilities for BPS extensions, and that is, Mike was, so I try to simplify it. Now I go to the more. These are data in medicine, depression, inventory, distribution in 3 sessions. What you see is multimodality. I'm very fascinated by that topic. And you see changing multimodality. These are Bayesian predictive distributions, which I have algorithms to do that, and how to combine that and how to change it over time. In bioinformatics, I look at DNA tandem repeats data, where you truly have, so these are data from Caucasian, African, and Asian individuals, and you also see that. So, and in economics, you have the cross-country GDP, where you clearly have some bimodal distribution. So my final point, so it all looks wonderful, but the technical computational challenge is find a connection between model complexity and the Monte Carlo simulation algorithm. Is that new? No, because in nonlinear optimization, we all know that if the target function very well behaved, you can do Newton-Raphson. If it's more difficult, you do quasi-Newton. If it's very difficult, you do a kind of random search. And we also are slowly in Bayesian analysis getting into that world. But there is a fundamental issue, the model information challenge. That's, Mike talked a bit about it, but learning to average over good and bad forecasts. You can always say, okay, I have some priors, the likelihood will punish what is about. That is not always the case. You truly have to model learning procedures. Mike talked a bit about it, and I've been trying to work on that. And we can use our machinery about the filtering, and it's closely related to machine learning, and it's interesting avenue of research to continue that. Okay, so the suggested path, research path for doing that, and Mike has mentioned this, use, and that's what I would say, dynamic mixtures. That is what I verify. Sylvia wrote a wonderful book about it. Mike started with the mixtures. Okay, so my final thing. Thanks, Mike, for being a marvelous leader in research and in applications. That's kind of unique.
Thank you. Mike, we are running a little late, but by all means, I think some interesting things to respond to. Please.
What, just 35 minutes? Toxic models, don't you love that? I don't think I'm going to use that. So Sylvia, both discussants, thank you. I really appreciate the comments on the specifics of the work in the talk, as well as, of course, some of the broader comments, and overridingly the historical perspectives that you both bring. So 1 or 2 points to pick up on the on the specifics, toxic models, yes. So in the particular set of BPDS examples where one is using mixtures, the baseline is a safe haven. And in time series, you can use that to monitor things and signal when all of the models are becoming toxic or whatever you want to do. How you choose it and how you develop it is going to be very context specific. So that's where some of the research questions are. Integrating, your second point, integrating different aspects of utility, different predictive metrics. I mean, there are many different statistical metrics that one brings to bear in looking at how a model is doing in informal ways, graphical ways. But certainly the BPDS framework is open to integrating specific numerical measures of model adequacy as part of a vector of utilities. Open questions about how you do that in any particular application. And of course, the bigger that vector is, then you've got more computational questions coming in. And the third point was your uncertainty quantification about decisions. Let me make one, I'm not quite sure I get the point there, but let me make a point that relates to that general theme of thinking. When we teach decision analysis, and not many students learn decision analysis these days, of course, and they all should, in my opinion, in statistics and economics and other areas. The focus is very often on, well, here's a model, here's a utility, here's the optimal decision. I encourage everybody to think about always accompanying that with a display of the predictive distribution of the utility at the optimal decision and at some other decisions that you might make that are not quite optimal. If you think, I'm a glass half full person. I always like to talk about utilities, but let's talk about losses. If you take an optimal decision with respect to a particular loss function, and suppose you have quadratic loss, so there's the mean of the distribution of loss, it may have a very, very, very fat tail. And depending on whether it's utility or loss, that could be good or bad. Okay? So uncertainty about optimal decisions is underplayed certainly in most textbooks and in most works I see, and the way people think about optimal decision making. It's always focused on behaving optimally. Finance is embraced the idea for decades, value at risk. Let's look at the tail of the loss distribution. So I'm not quite sure there's anything specific to the work I talked about today, as opposed to just let me echo Dennis, a broader view. Is our view of statistics too narrow when we teach it and when we present it in publications? And I guess I knew that I knew Sylvia. I don't remember having a beer with Herman in 1986 at Innsbruck, but it's lovely to have that reflection on De Finetti. So to Professor Van Dijk, the first point, simplicity, transparency in modeling. Yes, I mean, latent factor models, complex and not quite as transparent as we'd like them when we talk to people who don't think in terms of probability distributions and linear algebra. Yes, so it's a comment not specific to this particular way of thinking. And then the intersection with computation, of course, the more complex our models become, typically the harder they become to fit and analyze. And when one integrates the Yang into the analysis and is explicitly now thinking about decisions, in the Markowitz world, that's not so much of a step, but in the George Box world, when your predictive distributions depend on decisions, then the computational questions become very, very important because that expands the optimization challenges. So I'm very sensitive to those points. I don't have any solutions. We think in terms of latent processes and latent factors and parameters which are always latent. And so it's a generic challenge for us to continue when working with non-specialists. And then a couple of other one other specific point that I picked up from Herman's comments there. averaging over good and bad forecasts, averaging over good and bad decisions. That's really what BPDS is aiming to address, and it's one foundationally based theoretical framework within which you can begin to address that. In the example I showed, I mean, it is explicitly a dynamically reweighted mixture where the outcomes of the decisions advised by each model are playing a role too. So I'm very much in favor of more dynamic mixture modeling of various kinds. And just to be clear, some of you know, some of you don't. If you were at Herman's talk yesterday or follow his work, some of the work overlaps very intimately and explicitly, but there are lots of other things that Herman and his various groups that he works with have been doing in recent years that I have yet to understand as an example of BPDS. So there are lots of new ideas there that expand on it. If I can just put up my slides. I've got 30 seconds. Just to leave this on the screen. There are various topics involved here, but they're all in this general area. But the ones I think are more specifically focused on intersections with predictive synthesis ideas are in the Wednesday afternoon talk session on the left, and on the right, and on the Friday morning session on the right. But there are other things in there as well that don't naturally yet, as I understand it, fit within the framework I've presented. But I'm open to questions and interrogations as to how they might. And I guess that's why we're here, to try and understand how to expand on the way we think about the world and to improve the way we forecast and make decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, especially, but also to the two discussants for their careful read of the paper and their insightful comments. Given the time, I think that we will truncate questions, not have audience questions right now. What I would suggest is track Mike down, barrage of questions for Mike, but also all the folks who are listed there, if you can't find Mike, ask them about this stuff, because they're in the same space too. But thank you all for your attendance, and enjoy a little bit of food, and then reconvene for the afternoon sessions. Thank you.
Sorry, two quick announcements. Bear in mind that we have an alternative lift. If you want to go down to Place Bonaventure, where there is a food court, just turn left when you leave the room. Keep walking towards the end of the corridor, turn left again. Keep walking, you will see the lifts to go down. This is one. Second, some of the speakers of the afternoon haven't uploaded their talks yet. Please do so as soon as possible. And the push pins to place your posters on the boards are already available from the front desk. You can choose whichever poster board you like. Have a great afternoon.